Civilizing America, a user's guide from the ground up, Chapter 5. Agree on values, the good of the whole. Intangibles guide our action and mutual support. After you have gathered your own motivation, assembled a group, and focused on action, your next boundary of progress lies in helping your group think through the values it will apply. This effort needs to be deliberate for 4 reasons. The first is that to cooperate, large numbers of people need a common plan, a mutual understanding of what everyone is to do, and a role that satisfies them. A principle applying both to society and to any movement wishing to change it. We need a picture that orients our group and its effort, and values telling us why are the most fundamental pieces. The second reason is that many conditions in our lives are unconscious and invisible to us, but strangely limiting, like trying to wade through molasses. Circumstances we accepted before plant us in the few options now open, and often we must live our way through them rather than selecting them freely from alternatives. This pattern holds especially when others control us. When those with life and death power over us tell us what to do, we usually find it in our best course to comply, so that Nazism could take hold remarkably quickly in Germany, and communism in the Soviet Union. But in any country, a mainstream narrative fuses together the pressures on us that guide our expectations. We consent to our limited circumstances and make our life within them. The third reason is that why is harder to grasp than how. We can usually explain the mechanics of nearly any process as we trace causes to their effects, but why engages us in a subtle competition of abstractions that different individuals may view differently. The why is our enduring fuel for completing what we start, however, so that clarity about it is a primary group resource. Defining why, finally, is even more important when society is in turmoil. Objectives can appear harder to accomplish, stress is greater, and priorities more confusing. Conditions can affect the primary influence on our happiness, which appears to be the meaning of our experience. 2 factors combined. We first have an expectation, and then view ourselves as fulfilling it. That simple equation describes the operation of values, principles, laws, religion, relationships, meeting needs, physical pleasure, competition, commerce, and all creative expression. Each type of experience poses an expectation and a way human effort responds to it. Even war may become our central meaning. Because of this fundamental need for meaning, the values we affirm comprise our most basic expectation of ourselves. Aligning ourselves with them, we set goals day to day and achieve them, have standards that matter to us, and live up to them. Noticing we are dissatisfied, we can ask ourselves, what is my expectation? If we have none, we can determine a value that interests us, understand what actions of ours can respond, and then inquire, how am I fulfilling my expectation? Beyond the many things we want for our lives, for our world, we suggest the good of the whole as an organizing framework, a concept suggesting balance and proportion among values for ourselves, those we love, and the world. The good of the whole. The planet is the new whole. Because civilization affects it everywhere, we need to think beyond our direct experience. We want an attitude broad rather than balkanized, inclusive rather than selfish. We project beyond our personal lives and notice how the whole incorporates people, the environment, and the social world in a system-wide viewpoint, an ecological perspective that checks any specific outcome against its effect on all conditions. Looking beyond immediate personal benefit, we weigh an issue by its good to everything affected in the long view, minimizing isolated good, selfish good, special interest, and short-term gain. Since it is not accessible to our senses, we grasp it only as our imagination can fly the world and inspect the life and conditions of every being and the interplay between them. We reason from available details to grasp what is not instantly before us, disengage from self and present-oriented concerns, to weigh them against effects on others now or in the future. The scope of our solutions needs to match problems that may involve thousands, billions, millions, or billions of people with longer time horizons instead of temporary, isolated interests. Address fundamental causes with integrated responses. Strive for the harmony and trust that underline strong agreements, built in turn on shared values of love, truth, justice, connectedness, and high ethical standards. More must be thoughtfully responsible if civilization as we know it is to survive. Those who founded the United States tried to describe the good of the whole as they conceived it. Two summaries of their ideas are the preambles to the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, parts of which read thus. We will apply these quotations later in chapter 14. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These ideas are relevant to three issues important in the U.S. today. First, they speak to the national argument about whether judges should be originalists, following the meaning and intent of those framing the Constitution, or pragmatists, interpreting a living document according to present consequences. The limitation in the first view is that over 200 years ago, even the wisest could not imagine many conditions today. They assumed, for instance, that white male landowners would run government, and it did not occur to them that women and slaves would eventually vote. We can nevertheless return to the values they hoped would guide society, which is originalism in a better sense. Enduring constructive values can be both conservative and liberal. To take their simplest meaning, colonies became a nation by liberating, freeing themselves of unjust government, yet the founders believed the nation should conserve forever certain principles. Both emphases are inherent in life. We retain positive elements of the past and liberate new energy to advance. A second impact of these quotations, including everyone, created equal with inalienable rights, is that they attempt to alter history. From time immemorial, inclusion, equality, and rights have been a rare exception in an otherwise consistent picture of domination, inequality, and exploitation. That a government can survive while honoring inclusion, equality, and rights has not yet been demonstrated definitively. Current economic inequality in our own society, dominated by an oligarchy of wealth, moves in the wrong direction. And the Citizens United Supreme Court decision welcoming a tide of money into politics may not, quote, promote the general welfare or reflect that, quote, all men are created equal, unquote. The ghosts of dominance, inequality, and exploitation hover about us. A third significance of the principles in the preambles is their contrast with the actual design of government that gives a minority exceptional influence. Since the U.S. Senate needs 60 votes to overcome filibusters that can halt progress on nearly any issue, 40% of the Senate can prevent change. Even worse, quote, the fact that every state gets 2 senators, regardless of population size, means 17% of Americans can impose majority rule over the other 83%, unquote. Inviting the wealthy to steer the nation by manipulating a handful of elections. One person elected by a plurality in a single state, the Senate Majority Leader, can hamstring legislation urgent for the nation. Narrow regional priorities and self-interest can supersede broad needs, and our means of change are limited to the tools within this system. The challenge of intangibles. The good of the whole takes on both power and limits as an abstraction, a generalization. We cannot look at something and say, that is the good of the whole. It is an idea. But working with abstractions, we are more prone to mistakes because their limitations are not obvious. The less tangible the idea, the harder it can be to distinguish false applications from true, and realities from fancies. Without specific details, general concepts can be warped. Consider words in common use, like socialist and free enterprise. In a TV interview, a reporter in the Netherlands asked 2 women their thoughts about living in a socialist country. We just think of it as being civilized, one responded with a smile. Taking care of people did not seem to them to destroy freedom, progress, but rather was obvious, worth only a casual reference. A society's care for individuals signals its true prosperity. Most people think of socialism, however, as getting something for nothing. Poor people receiving resources without deserving them. But demonstrating how far meaning has drifted from its moorings, in recent decades this picture has been turned upside down. The rich obtain the free ride protection and resources of a government that for them is socialistic, while poorer classes experience the strict outcomes of truly free enterprise, in which losing means personal disaster. People may draw from a few clues to fix upon a word, admit only information that aligns with it, and ignore everything else. We can respond to someone using general terms in sweeping ways, capitalism, socialism, cultural Marxism, etc., by becoming a willing learner. We ask them if they would please translate the idea into practical terms we can understand. So tell me, who is harmed and who benefits? Who pays more taxes and less taxes? Who gets more services and less services? More opportunity and less opportunity? We define abstractions as people experiencing something. If they cannot do that, they do not know what they are talking about. We ask them to figure it out and get back to us. Any information they supply should be evidence we can check out. Threats. Threats to the good of the whole show up in attitudes before they become policies. We address them as early as we can, so public reflection can forestall political struggle. We may dismiss a value. Disregarding the moral quality of our decisions endangers us. In a cartoon of men seated around a long table, one says, "No, there may be an ethical issue here, but nothing that won't hose off." In a similar setting, another says, "About the ethics thing, does anyone have a problem with it?" With integrity, we do not hose off an unethical challenge and always have a problem with it. A business magazine suggested using responsible and decent in place of ethical to assess a decision. Is this the decent thing to do? Is it responsible? Business leaders defining their company's values should recognize practices that violate them. But threats to the good of the whole do not spontaneously trumpet in our ear. Our treatment of those accused of crimes can demonstrate warped values. Tolerance of police killing unarmed citizens violates individual rights and social trust. Imprisoning the poor for fines they cannot pay is an historic, unjust aberration of values. Worse treatment for blacks than whites is oppression. Malnourishing prison inmates is cruel, and refusing female inmates adequate self-care offends human dignity. Inadequate health services for the poor manifest a hard heart among the wealthy. Common values need to instruct us in what is worth doing. Another threat. We can isolate interests. We may be personally drawn to one issue, but as many facets of society affect our well-being, we need to engage with more people than limiting ourselves to a single note in a symphony. A large group organizing its energy around one need can have a fragmenting effect by dismissing 100 urgent issues. We cluster with people who never talk to other clusters and expect only winners and losers in access to resources. like July 4th games where everything is a tug of war. I win by making you lose. Polarized interests obstruct general progress. An interest promoted by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations in 1776 has affected society for over 2 centuries. It maintained that maximum profit for business benefited society most because investing it would expand both business and employment. Yuval Noah Harari critiques this in his narrative of human progress, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. In keeping with how human plans have shaped the world while often generating unforeseen destructive consequences, Harari notes downsides of Smith's premise. The profit motive, encouraged by Smith's book, actually drove an enormous expansion of slavery, depressed workers' wages, and funneled profits into lavish owner lifestyles rather than benefiting all, a mistake still embedded in the relationship between commerce and the public. Another threat. We can skip planning, leave things chaotic. Planning accounts for the patterned elements of society, such as the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, and our systems of contracts, standards, production, property, business, and law. It distinguishes what needs to be controlled from what should remain free. We rely on foresight instead of chance to define these zones, knowing that constructive outcomes seldom occur by luck, and believe systems should work for everyone using them. We minimize chaos with thoughtful improvements, consensus on values, intelligence in planning, and rational discussion. Another threat. We can train students for a fractured society, allocate resources of food, academic preparation, and employment opportunity by the outcome of a foot race, or any other single criterion, where the strongest, fastest, or most connected get the cream and others get little. Then admire the winners, celebrate them as examples for everyone else, and shame the losers who, quote, ought to have done better, unquote. Train everyone this way for 18 years, turn them loose in society, and watch. As adults, they will go after the resources of society that belong to everyone, and others must decide whether to allow them to monopolize what should be available to all. Another threat. We can deprive losers of resources. Society's benefit differs from individuals helping themselves. It is a complex organism that survives when individual organs function well, all parts healthy, or at least not poisoning the body. When those controlling its resources write off the poor, criminal, uneducated, politically non-influential, and socially marginalized, more human lives are wasted. Losers suffer more than winners and become victims and perpetrators in a dysfunctional subculture, unable to benefit from a culture swirling about them and more likely to sabotage others. Yet people largely recognize and accept their place in the system. In general, being rich predicts having rich children, and being poor predicts having poor children. Education is the quintessential resource. Society's long-term benefit is served best when everyone has enough education to participate, rather than with a small, well-educated elite and millions of functional illiterates. A fitting goal is at least 16 years of quality education for all. The undereducated can grow in numbers, passing along their woes with worsening outcomes for generations. Each person we discard is a tally mark towards social disintegration. In the 1950s, the English historian Arnold Toynbee commented on America. While acknowledging the exceptional standard of living in the U.S. then, he noted that as a corollary to our stress on the value of freedom, we are, quote, less keenly alive to the need for social justice, unquote, and see no need to restrain the, quote, able, strong, and rich to dole out justice to the incompetent, weak, and poor, unquote. The latter qualities appear to many as almost un-American, so we ignore them as best we can. A healthy society instead regards itself as a whole, strong enough to sustain benefit for its parts. A parallel is a naturalist about to examine a leaf who thinks first of the forest, the tree, the branch, and finally the leaf under a magnifying glass. With a healthy field to orient us, we address the specifics within it, while without the field, our isolated actions easily derail. Another threat. We can multiply advantage. Human nature can manifest both self-interest and altruism. Those with more of the former take advantage of others however they can. If we assume about the weakest it's their fault for not fighting for their peace, we declare progress to be from power and position instead of fairness. While individuals may think first about their own benefit, society needs a different view to protect itself. Decades ago, when my son was in preschool, I was parent helper for the day. When it was time for snacks, I carried around a platter, gave a piece of cake to each child, and was startled to notice that without thinking, I had given my son the largest piece on the plate instead of the next in line. Why? I wondered. Why did I benefit him over others? The snack for him came from a constructive interest in taking care of my own. But I had not distinguished my role as an impartial aid for all the children's needs from my role as provider for my son. I presumed that the pieces on the plate before me were fair enough, and that therefore I need not concern myself with fairness and was free to exert self-interest. No one suffered from my deed, but the same tendency applied to society's resources means nepotism, cronyism, log rolling, pork barrel, corruption, bribery, conflicts of interest, and favoring our constituents over others with equal needs. Instead, we should direct social policy first toward the health of the whole. From society's perspective, the adult holding the cake, we ask, what is the best course overall, and choose values we want the whole to emphasize. Should the rest of the world think, be careful in the United States, everyone there gets you any way they can, which is the foreseeable outcome of selfishness? Do we want a few to get most of the cake? Another threat. We can accentuate power. A dominant minority's selfish use of power has undermined past civilizations, as I explained in my prior book, and today threatens our own. The history of industrial development has been punctuated with terrible repression of the poor by the wealthy. This occurs, however, as a principle natural to all of us, goes off course with but a small error in thinking. From birth, we use our available capacities. A baby progresses from grasping a toy to engaging the mother, to crawling, running, and jumping. Steadily, they master their environment until others check them. No, you can't climb up there, or no, you can't eat that. We instinctively reach for more as our wants and our group define it. We use the power we have until something limits us. We do not need to label anyone as bad just because they employ power, but neither are others bad who seek to check their misuse of it. In his 2013 novel, A Delicate Truth, John le Carré describes a deep state, a moneyed elite, quote, non-governmental insiders from banking, industry, and commerce who rule in secret. Over the decades, people have gained influence who do not share the ideals of civil society and are not subject to electoral recall. Landlords, the super wealthy, lawyers, and financiers not accountable to historic values. Since those with power aim first to ensure their influence, they typically try to leverage government itself to assert their interests ahead of workers in overtime, right to organize, pay, and pensions, reflecting the historic dominance of the wealthy over the weak. And while we might dismiss a novel as non-factual, a shift towards such a society has been measured objectively in the transfer of wealth from the poorest to the richest. People suspecting the system is rigged may not realize how far it has morphed in that direction. A 2018 pre-Christmas headline read, quote, Sears execs to split $25 million in bonuses after telling workers no severance because of bankruptcy, unquote. Executives who led that once great company into bankruptcy, quote, reward themselves but not their workers. If no social force generates balance, only government can attempt it. All benefit from affirming the most constructive values. Another threat. We can ignore the big problems. An asteroid aimed at Earth in 20 years might drive nations to sacrifice in order to respond. Harder to imagine are the increasing pollution killing humans and other life forms, the effect of changing climate on different species and human resources, the spread of nuclear weapons around the world, and the potential for harm as thousands with generational grudges acquire destructive weapons. As the disparity between rich and poor expands, societies can be destabilized. The ultimate reservoir of chemical runoff everywhere is the ocean, which we are gradually killing, and we need to steady the economic system itself to prevent breakdown. People become lawmakers because selected by the public as the best in the nation to lead. But this elite group, willing, for instance, to spend tens of billions to send a few people to the moon or Mars, is like a family buying a beach condominium in the Caribbean, but before installing an indoor toilet at home. The condo may be a fine idea, but comes later. Life and death issues affecting people should lead. Is there hubris, furthermore, in expecting to sustain a human culture on Mars when we have not shown ourselves capable of taming life here? We appear not to have figured out how to make life even tolerable for many on this planet, and going far from home does not spontaneously make us more competent. Another threat. We can ignore others' needs. Two conditions especially make a disproportionate difference in people's lives: the preparation for social participation from family and institutions, and the opportunity to employ it. We might assume that we grant these to everyone, but oddly, doing well ourselves can cause others to do worse. In some U.S. regions, people are in poorer health due not to low income alone, but in proportion to the disparity between the lowest and highest incomes. When the income gap is large, the secure evidently have less incentive to invest in public services, such as health, education, and housing, feeding a destructive cycle. Crime and death rates climb, while the poor are disproportionately minorities. The secure design things to suit themselves, others are marginalized, and the network of support deteriorates. The gap is from refusing to improve conditions for all, intending good for the part instead of the whole. Another threat. We can seek short-term gain and blame others for limiting us. The closest eye may see most accurately, but may also be most self-interested, blind to the big picture, and inclined to extract every small advantage, even with long-term loss. Inmates of our prisons all once assumed that crime pays. Sociopaths are more motivated by short-term rewards. Constructive intentions derail with thinking too limited. A monstrous instance occurred during the Soviet attempt to industrialize by driving production and ignoring massive pollution that will degrade Russians' health for generations. When decision makers think too narrowly, values suffer. Miners in both West Virginia and Russia have died due to inadequate safety measures. Examples occur worldwide. Forests are cut down too fast and wildlife killed off. And the last fish of a species is tracked down by sonar-equipped vessels. When I was young, a bay near my home was bubbling with herring at certain seasons. My father put tree branches on the beach where the tide would reach them, and they would be covered with herring roe the next day, a culinary delicacy. Salmon followed the herring, so that fishing, even close to town, was always good. When decades of heavy fisheries depleted stocks, government had to determine who could fish, for what, when, and where, and the fish gradually returned. Even destroying a resource, some are first in line. When people refuse to limit themselves, government is left to check their out-of-balance self-interest. Without such a force asserting the well-being of the whole, extremes of wealth and poverty and threats to health occur. Had not Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and other books in the 50s and 60s called halt to deadly chemicals discharged into the environment, we could be ankle deep in them by now. Someone needed to protest, and only government had the power to respond. People's disproportionate self-interest is the biggest threat to an otherwise hugely successful market system. Some turned free to enterprise, cut corners against the good of the whole as far as they can. To protect themselves, others must erect safeguards that limit everyone, even those who do not take advantage. When everyone does it, the one who will not cut corners is driven out of business. Society must limit all to prevent injury to some, so that a company truly well-intentioned toward its employees, stockholders, environment, and society can prosper. I sympathized with business people's frustrations at regulation. My parents ran a small business. But the conditions they create demand the standards. Without self-restraint, society breaks down. Government turns oppressive, and social conditions deteriorate. Radio commentator Paul Harvey closed his daily program for years with the warning, quote, "Self-government won't work without self-discipline," unquote. A view we might call old-fashioned conservatism. Another threat. We can blame opposition. We are easily upset by our opponent's faults. Seeing hypocrisy, deception, slander, greed, injustice, cynicism, and manipulation around us, we may wish to crush them. But such traits in others can pull us down unless we are careful. If we respond with the same qualities they use, we can destroy our own values, fighting for a cause that cannot be won by fighting. With others' flaws an excuse for our own, we descend morally together. And we may lose in the end if we do not eventually enlist the goodwill of our opponents, asking them, how can we help you achieve your goals? We find out constructive purposes they do have and assist them, overcome evil with truth, and set a boundary against the negative. Another threat. We can ignore disability. To have a large, poor, dumb population and a small, rich, smart elite We need only allot our resources to aid the elite. Divide society. Make plans and programs for the well-off. Ignore the others, and justify this by saying they are all free to help themselves. Make the haves better starting from kindergarten, and favor them at every turn, even if it leaves behind 30 million functional illiterates. Nearly everyone, sooner or later, learns the importance of a little help from our friends. Some make it anyway and surmount daunting limitations, but others do not, and their odds worsen with each added burden, such as a disability in body, mind, or emotion. Poor teaching, few books, parents missing, substance abusing or criminal, racial discrimination, poverty, an antisocial group like a neighborhood run by gangs, lack of personal, ethical, moral training, no means of contributing to society, and lack of respectable employment. With memories of success and achievement gone, and such a crushing heap upon them, a successful person might be startled at how poorly they would function. Limitations can kill the spirit. There are only so many Harvard scholarships available. Another threat. We can ignore social goals. A lesson for the U.S. came with the awarding of the 1998 Nobel Prize for Economics to Amartya Sen for his study of human development in different countries. Life expectancy in Costa Rica 20 years ago lagged slightly behind the U.S., but it has overtaken us. In 2018, it was 79.6 years, and in the U.S., 78.7 years, following the latter's multi-year pattern of decline. The reason for Costa Rica's steady advance over many decades, Sen found, is that in 1949 it disbanded its army to focus on basic health and education. On the Human Development Index, measuring income, education, and life expectancy 20 years ago, it ranked 62nd in per capita income, i.e. in 61 countries people were richer on average, but was 43rd on improving education and basic health, far beyond other countries with comparable resources. Income growth was not the key variable, but rather goals for the good of the whole. Their choice to use their meager resources to help all their people. If Costa Rica can raise life expectancy to 79 years with an average annual income a quarter of the U.S.'s, think what the U.S. could do. The starting point is caring about everyone. Recall the scorn heaped on the war on poverty in the 60s, an effort that was working and could have accomplished more had not Vietnam consumed national resources and the elite funneled American productivity into their own hands ever since. Now, we deliver expensive services to some and few to others. Many of our schools are a scandal. Tens of millions of Americans lack health insurance, and 13 million children do not get the food they need. Society's question of conscience is, do we care about people who are struggling. States of belief. To achieve balance among the challenges represented in the good of the whole, we need to understand and manage our unconscious tendency. One way is to recognize our state, a standard condition coloring our responses as in our state of mind. We tend to presume that it is always correct, and when it is calm and balanced, we act effectively. An entire social sector can share a positive state, but when it turns negative, can behave worse even when a better course is obvious to others. Mark Gerzon found 6 inclusive states people assume unwittingly from their occupation and life experience. Religions, corporations, disempowered, media, transformations, and governing. Each presenting a gift and a danger to society. Religions offer faith, but are challenged by dogmatism. Corporations offer ingenuity, but are challenged by materialism. The disempowered, conscience versus defeatism. The media, communication versus sensationalism. The transformationals, vision versus elitism. The governing, leadership versus divisiveness. A state that defines balance by referring only to itself tends to inflict its danger on society. If we are unsure whether we personally offer the gift or danger of our state, a hint arises from exaggerating what we suspect is our tendency. How would my feelings affect the world if they had their way unchecked? The outcome should clearly be growth-enhancing or destructive. A refined sense of benefit. Moral issues we think are obvious may in fact be arguable. It is good to help people, we believe, but giving them every advantage so they never need exert themselves by general agreement weakens character. People are formed mainly by what they attempt and accomplish. So, applying that principle, do we weaken the character of an unemployed woman who wants to feed her children from our monthly stipend? Do we place higher value further on her children's health than on her weakened character? And if her character is weakened, how do we judge a CEO paid tens of millions seeking subsidy for his company? Do we damage his character proportionate to his subsidy? To know, we apply moral qualities sensitively, knowing that one intending their own benefit seldom judges best how far it should extend. Takers tend not to limit themselves, saying, we are starting to injure people, so let's back off. Or maybe we have enough. Let's stop now and leave some for others. Instead, they seize everything in reach and thank their luck if it is more than someone else's. Society's choice is how much to help them take. Humans' acquisitive tendency unavoidably requires that others set limits. Either government, a dominant religion, opposing interests, or public opinion must wrench the merely self-interested into restraining their injury to others. No one is expected to be objective, seeking their own gain. Maximizing benefit occurs in all fields. How much pollution will they cause before they consider self-policing? How many non-renewable resources would they extract before thinking, I'll leave some in the ground for future generations? How many trees would they cut before caring they create a wasteland? How many fish would they catch? How many animals kill off? How much of the economic pie do people cut for themselves when they wield the knife? We never ask them because they cannot know. They expect to go as far as their profit-rewarded ingenuity can carry them until mute reality or public indignation sets limits. Jared Diamond compiles evidence from early societies in support of the overkill hypothesis. Archaeological findings seem to indicate, he writes, that when humans first show up on an island, in a region, or on a continent, they kill off the indigenous large animals within 1,000 years. They do not say, quote, these mastodons are so valuable, or this big snake, lizard, moa, lemur, or flightless bird. Maybe we should leave these few alive so they will be here for others, unquote. But willingly cut down the last tree on the island, Cyprus, Easter Island, and ate the last egg of the last big bird. Some hunter felt lucky rather than remorseful to harvest the final specimen. Within a couple decades after the Civil War, advancing settlers needlessly almost killed off the vast bison herds on our own Great Plains that were the food and clothing of the indigenous population. We set limits on each other in order to live together, and sometimes must say, you've taken more than your share. Your portion has to be cut back for the system to be fair. We forget how easily the tendency to take plays upon us and fall in step with the social norm that declares, if you have power, use it till someone stops you. Shady dealings by banks and corporations will continue until the public declares a stop, as occurred a century ago when trusts attempted to carve up America for themselves. Containing excess will always be a challenge because rooted in humans' drive to enhance themselves. Imagine you are an early settler migrating west and you find a valley with an attractive stream and pool where you might make your home. Imagine that Indians have lived there, but another settler comes from the opposite direction to claim land also. Where do you place the boundaries of your claim? Do you try to get the stream and pool? Or acknowledge the Indians' rights? Or accept the opposing settler's claim? After answering, imagine that others were there first and had no weapons, but you come with weapons. What do you do? Discuss the options each of the three groups face. Devise a solution the larger society could adopt that you would regard as fair, regardless of which of the three roles you might occupy.